At that moment, red eyes that she could barely make out under his hood turned to her. He's so tall. She can also tell he's a handsome guy just by looking at his nose. She hurriedly avoided his gaze, but not before their eyes briefly met. Well, that is embarrassing. She should have apologized, right? At that moment, she heard him speak in a distasteful tone. What are you looking at? Wow, he's so rude. It was true that she had stolen a glance at him first and displayed bad manners, but she didn't want to apologize to someone who spoke so impolitely to a stranger. She added, "Oh, I was looking for the thing you're buying right now." But the item she picked was a armor polish. She tried to maintain a serious expression. Knights were usually associated with armor, but in reality, they didn't have to wear them unless they were fighting in a war. In other words, armor polish was a useless thing to her. She didn't want to admit that. She had been secretly looking at the cloaked man. After the owner had disappeared, the man next to her placed a gold coin on the table, picked up his polish, and turned around. She would have ignored him if he had placed down a small amount of money. However, a gold coin was an enormous value. This amount could feed a commoner's family for 2 weeks. She shouted after him loudly and clearly about his change, but he didn't respond. She followed him and shouted even louder. He should have been able to hear her, and she began to wonder if he was deaf. At that moment, the man stopped in his tracks. He turned around and stared at her. Okay, so he's not deaf. Despite embarrassment for causing a commotion, she said, "I think you heard the wrong thing from the owner. The amount you paid is 10 times the price." While she was explaining to the man, she heard Geraldine call for her. The man took that opportunity to leave the place. Next to a carriage parked in a vacant lot, a short-haired woman greets, "Your Highness, Crown Prince," and informs that she had informed Duke Floyan of his appointment. As response, he nods. Although his voice was cold as usual, he sounded somewhat annoyed. The man was thinking about the woman in the shop. Reminiscing what had just happened, the young man frowned. On other side, her father questioned, "What is that, Jubelian?" For some reason, her father bore a displeased expression. She quickly answered him, "It's armor polish." Then her father glanced at her with a slight frown, then sighed and said, "Let's go." She began to follow her father for who knows how long. When an obstacle appeared before her eyes, her composure threatened to crumble. Stairs. She had been following him for several hours that day, so her feet throbbed. She thinks that, I only need to endure this a little while longer. Her legs lost their strength as she tried to take another step. Fortunately, she didn't fall down because her father grabbed her in his arm. She hurriedly apologized and tried to back away from him, but he held on to her wrist. The next thing, she was being carried by her father. He continued to walk while holding her in his arms, that they are going back to the carriage. She tried to convince him to put her down, but he ignored. She thinks, why is he acting like this today? He had also acted strange when they were shopping. Maybe it was due to the stress, but her head was throbbing. It hurts. Suddenly, she became unconscious of how strange she felt. She heard her father speak. "Jubelian." That was the last thing she heard before consciousness blackened. She tried to open her eyes to see who was murmuring in her ears. She could barely make out a man with a blurry and distorted face. It didn't help that her body felt like it was floating in the clouds, giving her no sense of reality. Jubal? It was strange. He didn't have a reason to call her like that, or look at her with a face that seemed to be on the verge of tears. No, this can't be. If you're gone, It is said that dreams are unconscious expressions of what the dreamer desperately wants. She hears, "Please wake up." What a terrible dream. As soon as she thought that, she sank into the darkness again. When she gained consciousness, she was lying on her bed. "Are you feeling okay, Lady Floyang?" The first person she saw was Alan, the Floyan house's family doctor. Only then did she realize that she hadn't fallen asleep but passed out. "How long has it been, Alan?" she asked. 3 days, my lady." She observed her surroundings. Maids looked back at her with anxious expressions. Marilyn, Julia, and Sella. She counted the maids in her room. Her father was nowhere in sight. Well, she didn't even expect him to be there in the first place. He hasn't shown up to her debutante ball either. At that moment, the door opened. It was her father who had come through the door. Why is he here? She stared at him, unable to believe that he was actually there. He gently placed his hand on her head. "You're awake." Is this a dream? She could barely believe what was happening. As she continued to stare at him unconsciously, his hand retracted. "Rest," he said. She stared blankly at his retreating figure, then laughed to herself. "Don't be fooled, Jubilian." He had been cold-hearted towards her ever since she was young. He had even detained her in the original novel. He only checked up on me because he doesn't want to look like a heartless father who neglects his sick daughter. Some people might wonder why the Duke's only daughter would even bother studying, but the reality wasn't that simple. Her father wouldn't pass down his title to an incompetent person like her, so it was likely that he would get remarried to produce a successor. In that case, she would also have to get married or become independent with only a small share of her inheritance to support herself. Getting married would be too risky. There was only one solution. If she gets some inheritance and become independent, she might be able to make more money. But it was so boring for her, of reading books. Heading for study, she left her room and walked through a long corridor and walked through the sitting room. She would arrive at her father's office after passing one more corner. "Please don't try to persuade me any further." The sound of voices coming from around the corner made her come to a halt. Then a voice, which didn't lose to the other voice in terms of its elegance, spoke up. "It's not persuasion, but a warning." She immediately came to her senses. Unless she heard wrong, that was clearly the voice of her father. Just the fact that he's able to hold a conversation with my father for so long makes him remarkable. Not wanting to be caught, she quickly hid behind the corner. Luckily, her spot was hidden from view by the pillar in front. Glancing at the hallway in front of the sitting room, she saw her father and the back of a younger man wearing a black cloak. Wow, he's really tall. He was above the average height for a man, taller than even her father. Rather than looking rough, his back looked quite nice. But why does it feel like I've seen that back figure before? She thought. Your interference is unnecessary. Wanting to get a better look at the man's face, she peeked my head out a little further. I let out a gasp. Used to her father's face, most handsome men would leave me unimpressed. But after seeing this man's beauty, she couldn't help but admire his good looks. The image they both gave off was cold, but the air surrounding them was slightly different. Her father seemed more sharp and intelligent, while the man seemed to give off a darker and more dangerous vibe. Then she saw her father place a hand on the man's shoulder. Max. Was that his name? Max? Hearing her father, who was not the type to call out someone's name affectionately like that, her doubts grew stronger. She was trying to guess what kind of relationship they shared when she saw her father suddenly turn his head. That was close. Quickly hiding behind the pillar again, her heart was racing from almost getting caught. When her heart finally calmed down, she frowned. Wait, why am I even hiding? She heard her father speak again. The sword exists not to shed blood, but to protect what is precious. But it seems you want to go against that judgment. Her father's stern voice sounded so harsh that it almost unconsciously made her flinch. However, the young man, whom the scolding was directed towards, remained unfazed. Rather than go against it, I simply feel there's no need to create such a weakness. The moment she heard him speak about weakness, she automatically gave a bitter smile. She wondered what weakness her father has that he wants to protect. The man's piercing voice broke her out of my bitter thoughts. Teacher. Did he say teacher? She never heard anything about her father having an apprentice. Shocked by the new revelation, I do not want to listen to any more of your preachings. I'll be taking my leave now. The way the man spoke was so dry and without warmth that it made her father look affectionate in comparison. One day you'll find one too, a precious existence that you'll want to protect. Her father opened his mouth to speak once more. His voice sounded hard, yet affectionate at the same time. Never having it directed towards her, it was an unfamiliar tone. She heard her father's apprentice speak in a chilling tone. I wonder about that. Rather than a precious existence, it seems I found a hiding rat. The moment she heard the horrific word that instinctively brought out her fears, she came to her senses. What? A rat? Goosebumps rose all over her body due to extreme disgust. Where is it? She wasn't in a position where she could move freely, so had to settle for looking around using just her eyes. Shall I catch it? He said. She hates rats. Coming to this decision, she was gathering up her courage when she suddenly heard her father speak. If you dare mess in any way, I won't forgive you, even if it's you. It was a chilling voice she had never heard from him till now. It almost felt like a warning directed towards him. She quietly escaped. As soon as Juvelian's presence vanished, the tension in the air settled down slightly. Those footsteps really bother me. The younger man frowned, unable to pinpoint the reason behind his discomfort. Max. Hearing his name called, Max turned to stare at his master. Yes. Did you call that child a rat while being fully aware of who that child was? At a glance, his tone was no different than usual, but the look in his eyes revealed Regis's furious state. It had been a long time since his master last took off his usual mask. I do not know who it was. There was only one person who could make his teacher so sensitive. Max had already figured out the identity of that someone, but he chose to scowl at his teacher instead. It had been 10 years since Max had learned how to use a sword from his master, having first met him when he was 12 years old. Max knew how strict and blunt his teacher was, but there were a few moments where his master lightened up. That was my daughter. It was only during the times he talked about his one and only daughter. Max recalled the name he always heard his teacher say. Juvel. As soon as he said her name, Max saw the corners of the Duke's mouth rise in a subtle smile. That's right. He had only mentioned the daughter's nickname, but it was enough to relieve some of the tension on his teacher's face. The young man furrowed his brows. I don't understand. When he was young, the moment he lost his mother, his family became nothing more than an enemy, threatened his life. The one who taught him how to wield a sword and protect himself during those terrifying times was none other than his teacher, Duke Floyan. At one point, Max held so much respect for his teacher that he wished to be like him, but he felt assured that that was no longer the case. To think he himself would tie a rope around his neck for someone like that. The teacher before him now looked pathetic in his eyes. This child is the only reason he haven't become a monster, the reason he can exist as a human being. All this time, his adorable daughter was the only reason he was able to endure without going insane. When she returned to her room, she told her maids that she saw a rat. "A rat, milady." "I'm sure I heard the butler say he hired someone to catch all the rats," Marilyn reassured her in a calm manner. "Please don't worry, milady. I'll report this to Mrs. Ferris and make sure no rat will ever be seen again." Mr. Derrick gave report to the Duke. Regis rubbed his forehead while letting out a small sigh. It seems she misunderstood the conversation earlier. About rats. She thought of real rats, which is not in Mansion. Wondering how he could ease his daughter's worried mind, Regis became silent in serious thought. Derrick breathed an inward sigh before reporting what he always hesitated to mention. Also, Sir Mikhail has sent another letter. The moment the name Mikhail was heard, the Duke's eyes changed drastically. Let's see how future unfold for them. Hope you all liked it. See you in the next chapter.